The sun sank low behind the Arizona mesas, turning the sky into a bleeding horizon of gold and rust. On that lonely stretch of prairie, where wind whispered through brittle grass and coyotes cried at dusk, Clara Whitmore worked the land that had both sustained and punished her for 5 long years. Her hands, once soft and quick with laughter, were now rough from chopping wood and milking cows. Her dress was faded from too many washes in the creek. She no longer looked like the young bride who had come west full of hope. She looked like the land itself, weathered, stubborn, unyielding. Each day followed the same rhythm. Wake before dawn, feed the animals, mend the fence, haul water, pray for rain that never came. And when the day ended, she'd sit by the empty chair at the table, the chair that had once belonged to John Whitmore, her husband, a rancher killed when a frightened herd trampled him one black night 5 years ago. People from town had come to console her then. They'd brought casseroles, whispered prayers and pity. "You're still young," they had said. "You'll find love again." But Clara hadn't. Love, she decided, was a fool's luxury. She buried her heart with John out on the back hill, beneath a small wooden cross. Since then, she'd known no touch but the wind and no comfort but work. That evening, a thunderstorm gathered far in the west, painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and gray. Clara was hauling a bale of hay toward the barn when she heard it, the desperate snort of a horse, the faint thud of hooves struggling in the dirt. She froze, heart hammering. The land was empty for miles. No one should be out here. She stepped closer, gripping the pitchfork like a weapon. The wind carried the sound again, a groan this time, low and pained. Behind the barn, half hidden among mesquite and dust, lay a man sprawled beside a chestnut horse that was lathered with sweat. He wasn't white. His skin was bronze, his hair long and black, tangled with blood. The blue beads woven into his braids marked him as Apache. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd heard the stories: raids on ranches, stagecoaches burned, settlers taken. Her first thought was to run inside and bar the door. But as lightning split the sky, she saw his face, young, feverish, and pale from blood loss. His chest rose shallowly and a bullet wound darkened his shoulder. He wasn't a monster. He was dying. Clara hesitated, torn between fear and something deeper, something human. She remembered kneeling beside John's broken body all those years ago, her own hands useless against the blood that wouldn't stop. No one had come for her then, and now, standing in the rain, she couldn't walk away from someone else's suffering. With a muttered prayer, she dropped the pitchfork and knelt beside him. "You're not dying on my land," she whispered. The man stirred, murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. His eyes opened briefly, dark, unfocused, and met hers. It was only an instant, but it felt like being struck by the same lightning that split the heavens above. She dragged him, inch by inch, into the barn, sheltering him from the downpour that finally broke loose. By the time she bandaged his wound with strips torn from her petticoat, her heart was pounding from exhaustion and fear. He didn't move again. When the thunder faded, Clara sat beside him in the hay, staring at the stranger she had just saved. She could feel the warmth of his skin beneath her trembling fingers, smell the smoke and earth clinging to him. He was everything she'd been taught to fear, and yet in the hollow quiet of that storm, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Clara looked at him for a long time before whispering, "You'll live, Apache. You hear me? You'll live." And as the wind sighed through the cracks in the barn, she realized that for the first time since her husband's death, she wasn't alone anymore. When dawn came, the prairie glistened from the storm and the air smelled of wet dust and pine. Clara sat by the barn door, watching sunlight creep across the floorboards until it reached the man lying in the hay. He hadn't moved much since she'd bandaged him, but the fever that had burned through him all night had begun to ease. His breathing was steady now, slow and deep like the rhythm of a drum. She had watched over him through the darkness, replacing the cool cloth on his forehead, jumping at every noise outside. Fear had kept her awake, but something else had too, a strange pull she couldn't name. When he finally stirred, she set her cup of coffee down and knelt beside him. His eyes opened, dark as obsidian, alert even in weakness. He tried to sit up, but pain stopped him halfway. "Don't move," she said softly. "You'll tear it open again." He blinked at her, confusion flickering across his face. She pointed to his shoulder, showing him the bandage she'd wrapped. "Bullet," she explained. "You were shot." He looked down at the wound, then at her. His gaze wasn't hostile, only cautious, like a wild animal unsure whether the outstretched hand meant help or harm. Slowly he nodded once. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, then spoke with a thick accent. "Taza." The word came out low and steady, like the earth itself had said it. Clara swallowed hard. "Taza," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "I'm Clara." He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes drifted around the barn, the walls, the tools, the buckets. She could almost see him weighing everything, deciding if he was safe. After a moment, she stood and poured water from a tin cup, offering it to him. He reached for it with his left hand, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through her chest. His skin was warm, his grip firm despite the weakness in him. "Drink," she urged. He obeyed, the water trickling down his chin. When he finished, he looked at her again and nodded in quiet gratitude. That small gesture made something loosen in her chest. She hadn't realized how long it had been since someone looked at her like that. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with simple, honest respect. Over the next 2 days, Taza's strength began to return. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words were careful, deliberate. But he watched everything, her movements, her animals, the way she folded her hands when she prayed. Sometimes she caught him staring at her as if trying to understand what kind of woman would risk so much to save an enemy. One evening, she came into the barn with a bowl of stew. "You need food," she said, handing it to him. He took it and murmured something she didn't understand, then pointed to himself and said slowly, "Apache." "I know," she whispered. He tilted his head. "You afraid?" She hesitated, her pulse quickening. "I was. Not anymore." A faint smile touched his lips. Quick, fleeting, but real. It made her chest tighten. They ate together in silence, the firelight flickering over his face. Every now and then he would glance at her and she'd look away too quickly. But inside she felt warmth spreading through her, the first she'd felt in years. That night after he fell asleep, Clara lingered by the barn door, staring at the man resting in her hay. The storm had passed, but she knew another kind of storm was beginning, one that had nothing to do with the sky. This man, this stranger, had come from a world she'd been taught to fear. Yet when he looked at her, she didn't see an enemy. She saw life returning to the empty places inside her. And though she didn't yet understand it, she knew something in her world had already begun to shift. For the first time since she'd buried her husband, she wasn't just surviving, she was feeling. The summer storms came back 3 nights later, rolling in from the mountains like dark ghosts. Thunder echoed across the plains, shaking the barn walls and making the horses whinny in their stalls. Clara stood by the door, lantern in hand, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Inside, Taza sat near the fire she'd built, his long hair damp from washing, his wounded arm bound neatly in fresh linen. He was healing fast, too fast for the part of her that still worried what might happen if someone discovered him. The army patrols rode near every few days, searching for raiding parties and if they ever found an Apache warrior on her land. The consequences didn't bear thinking about. Still, she hadn't told a soul. Not her neighbor, Mrs. Kelly, not the supply merchant in town. She couldn't. Because every time she thought about turning him in, she remembered the quiet strength in his eyes, the way he'd whispered her name that morning when he first managed to stand. "Clara." It had sounded different in his voice. Softer, like a prayer. Now, as rain hammered the roof, she crossed the barn with a blanket in her arms. "The wind's turning cold," she said. "You'll need this." He looked up from the small fire, his expression unreadable. "You not sleep?" he asked slowly. "I can't. Storms keep me awake." He nodded, gaze fixed on the flames. "Storms speak," he murmured. Clara tilted her head. "Speak?" He tapped his chest, then the roof above them. "Sky talks to earth. Like man and woman." Her breath caught at that, though she wasn't sure why. She smiled faintly, unsure how to answer. "I suppose it does." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain. Then she sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat of the fire and of him. His scent filled the air, smoke, rain, and something wild like cedar and sage. "You should rest," she said quietly. "You'll need your strength." "I rest," he said, then turned to her. "But you? Tired here?" He touched his heart lightly, her lips parted. "You can tell?" He nodded once. Your eyes, he said, searching them.
They carry ghosts. The word struck her harder than she expected.
She looked away, pretending to fix her shawl. I suppose they do.
My husband John died 5 years ago.
Since then, I've just been living day to day. Taza was silent. When she glanced back, he was still watching her, but there was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. I know loss, he said softly. My brother died in White Man's War. My mother, too. Her heart ached at his tone. So much pain on both sides of this vast land. So much blood spilled, and yet here they sat, sharing warmth, sharing silence. Lightning flared, illuminating the barn for a heartbeat. Clara saw his face clearly then. Sharp cheekbones, deep eyes, a faint scar tracing his jaw. He was beautiful in a way that frightened her, not because of danger, but because she could feel her heart remembering how to beat again. She tried to stand, to break the moment, but his voice stopped her. Clara, he said, her name falling from his lips like a secret. Why you help me? Her throat tightened. Because no one helped me when I needed it. For a moment they just looked at each other, the widow and the warrior, two souls carved by sorrow. Then Taza reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. His fingers brushed hers, rough against rough. She didn't move. Outside, thunder rolled like distant drums. Inside, the world narrowed to the space between their hands. Neither spoke again, but in the quiet that followed, Clara felt something ancient stirring in her blood, something she had buried for 5 long, empty years. It wasn't just compassion anymore. It was connection, a dangerous, fragile, living thing. And as the storm raged around them, she realized that the sound of the rain wasn't keeping her awake this time. It was him. By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the earth soft and steaming under the desert sun. Clara rose early, her mind heavy with thoughts she didn't quite dare name. Taza had gone outside before dawn, despite her protests. When she found him, he was standing by the corral, one arm bound in a sling but his posture proud, his gaze fixed on the far horizon where the mountains glowed red. You shouldn't be up, she said, stepping toward him. He didn't look at her. I need to move. Body heals with wind, not walls. His words were slow but certain, and she smiled faintly despite herself. You sound just like my husband used to. Always working before he was ready. At that, Taza turned, his dark eyes softening. You loved him. She hesitated, hands twisting the edge of her apron. Yes, I did. Then after a long pause, she added quietly, but love doesn't keep a person alive. Something unreadable crossed his face. Maybe not, he said, but it keeps the heart alive after. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. He said it so simply, so truthfully, that she felt a lump rise in her throat. The wind tugged at her hair, lifting strands across her face, and for the briefest second she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Not the widow or the rancher, but the woman beneath all that loss. By afternoon, the sound of horses broke her reverie. She froze, her heart dropping. Dust rose along the ridge. Soldiers. Without thinking, she ran to the barn. Taza, she whispered urgently. They're coming. He stepped from the shadows, already alert. His eyes narrowed as he heard the hoofbeats. Hide, she said, pulling open the trapdoor to the cellar beneath the hayloft. Quickly! He hesitated. You will lie for me? Her pulse thudded in her ears. Yes, now go. He held her gaze for a heartbeat, long enough that she saw both trust and sorrow there. Then he slipped into the darkness below, vanishing just as the soldiers' voices drew near. Clara closed the trapdoor and kicked loose straw over it before stepping outside, forcing her face into calm. 3 men rode up to her fence, led by a grizzled officer with a scar across his cheek. Morning, ma'am, he called. We're tracking a wounded Apache. Reports say he was seen near here after the storm. Her throat went dry, but she managed a steady tone. Haven't seen anyone, Captain. Only storm clouds and hungry coyotes. The officer studied her, his eyes narrowing. Mind if we take a look around? Go ahead, she said, heart hammering. They dismounted, searching the barn, the chicken coop, the shed. Each step on the boards above Taza's hiding place made her want to scream. She forced herself to stay still, arms folded, praying the pounding of her heart didn't give her away. Finally, the captain shook his head. Nothing here, he said. But if you do see him, ma'am, be careful. These Apaches don't spare women, she smiled tightly. I'll remember that. When they rode off, she stood in the dust until their silhouettes vanished beyond the hill. Then she ran to the barn, pulling open the trapdoor. They're gone, she whispered. Taza climbed out slowly, silent as smoke. You could have given me, he said after a moment. Her voice trembled. I couldn't. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flicker of firelight in his eyes. Why? She swallowed. Because I don't want more death in this place. Something inside him seemed to soften at that. He reached out, fingers brushing a loose strand of her hair away from her face. You brave, he said softly. And kind. Both together. Rare. Her breath hitched, her whole body aware of how near he was. The air between them grew warm and heavy, carrying the scent of hay, smoke, and rain-soaked earth. Clara wanted to step back. She didn't. Instead, she whispered, You should rest now. But when she turned, she felt his gaze follow her. And for the first time in years, she wished the night would last forever, just so she wouldn't have to face what her heart was beginning to remember. The wind turned restless that evening, whispering through the cracks in the barn and rattling the lantern hung from the beam. Clara moved about quietly, her thoughts scattered. She had lied to soldiers, hidden a fugitive, and risked her life for a man she barely knew, yet somehow she felt more alive than she had in years. Taza was seated near the small fire she'd built, sharpening his knife with slow, steady motions. His wound had healed enough for him to move freely, though his shoulder was still wrapped in linen. The faint glow of the flames painted his skin in gold and shadow, and Clara found herself pausing at the sight. He looked up and caught her staring. I made stew, she said quickly. Holding up the bowl, he nodded, taking it from her hands. You cook like Sun Woman, he murmured. She blinked. What does that mean? He hesitated, searching for the words. Strong, warm, keeps life. The simplicity of his answer made her chest ache. No man had called her that, not since John. And the way Taza said it wasn't flattery. It was reverence. She sat beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. The rain began again, pattering softly on the roof. The smell of stew fire and wet hay filled the air. He ate slowly, and when he was done, he handed her the empty bowl and whispered, Thank you. You're welcome, she said, smiling faintly. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm build. Lightning flickered through the cracks in the boards, briefly illuminating his face. He looked at her then, not with hunger, not with command, but with something deeper. Why you live alone? He asked softly, her throat tightened. Because there's no one left. Family? All gone. Husband too. He nodded, the firelight dancing in his eyes. You still wear ring, he said, glancing at her hand. Clara looked down at the thin gold band on her finger. She had never taken it off. Not through the years of silence, not through the loneliness. It's all I had left, she whispered. Taza was quiet for a long moment. Then very gently he reached out. His rough fingers brushed her hand, tracing the ring. Not to remove it, but to acknowledge it. He part of you, he said. But you still live. Heart still beats. The words trembled through her like wind through tall grass. She wanted to speak, but her voice was gone. When his fingers lingered on hers, she didn't pull away. The storm outside grew wilder, thunder shaking the earth. The lantern flickered, then went out, leaving only the glow of the dying fire between them. She could see him in the dim light. The steady rise and fall of his chest, the solemn strength in his face. Her pulse raced, wild and confused. For 5 years she'd felt nothing but emptiness. Now her heart felt full. Too full, Clara, he whispered, her name in his voice. Soft, reverent, broke something inside her. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly his hand was on her cheek, rough and warm, and her breath caught. His thumb brushed her skin, tracing the path of a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then the space between them vanished. His lips found hers, slowly, uncertainly at first, then with growing need. The kiss was not the desperate hunger of strangers, but the rediscovery of something sacred. When she pressed her forehead to his, tears slid freely down her face. I thought I'd forgotten how, she whispered. He drew her closer, his voice low. The heart never forgets. The firelight flickered against their faces as they held each other, the storm raging around them like a witness. The world outside faded, the soldiers, the fear, the years of grief. All that remained was warmth, breath, and the trembling truth that life had found her again. When dawn finally came, soft and gold through the barn's cracks, Clara lay awake beside him, listening to the sound of rainwater dripping from the roof. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the steady beat of her heart and knew it was alive. The next morning dawned clear and sharp, the desert air washed clean by rain. But the peace that sunlight brought to the land could not reach Clara's heart. She moved quietly through the cabin, hands trembling as she poured water into a tin basin. Her reflection in the rippling surface startled her. There was color in her cheeks, a softness around her mouth that hadn't been there yesterday. The memory of the night still lingered. The feel of Taz's hands, the warmth of his breath against her neck, the way the world had fallen away until only his heartbeat had mattered. It had not been madness. It had been life coming back to her after too long buried. Yet with morning came the truth she could not ignore. Taza was an Apache warrior, a fugitive. She was a white settler woman in a land that already hated the thought of them breathing the same air, let alone sharing the same bed. She stepped outside, clutching her shawl tightly around her. The sun was already fierce, glinting off the wet earth. Taza was near the corral, tightening the strap on his horse's saddle with his good arm. He turned when he heard her, his eyes soft, his expression unreadable. "You wake," he said quietly. She nodded, forcing a faint smile. "You shouldn't be out there. The soldiers—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "They will come again, soon." The words hit her like a slap of cold water. "Then you'll have to go," she said, her voice barely steady. He walked toward her, slow and sure. "You want me to go?" Clara opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her throat was tight, her chest aching. Every part of her wanted to say no. But the world beyond her land was cruel. The army had orders, and mercy wasn't among them. "I have to keep you safe," she said finally. He studied her for a long time, the morning wind tugging his dark hair across his face. "You kept me alive," he said. "Now you push me away." Her eyes filled with tears. "If they find you here, they'll kill you. And me too, maybe." "I can't let that happen." He was silent. And in that silence she heard all the things he didn't say, the grief, the understanding, the pull that bound them. Finally, he said, "Then I go before sun climbs high." Clara turned away so he wouldn't see the tears falling freely now. "I'll pack you food," she whispered. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his breath on her ear. "Last night," he began softly, "you were not afraid." She froze. "I am not sorry for that," he said. "Not for one heartbeat." She turned, her gaze meeting his. "Neither am I," she whispered. Then without another word she went inside, gathering what she could. Bread, jerky, a small pouch of dried fruit. Her hands shook as she tied the cloth bundle. When she returned, he was standing beside his horse, reins in hand. The sunlight caught the turquoise pendant around his neck. She had noticed it before but never asked its meaning. He untied it now and held it out to her. "For you," he said simply. "So you remember the man you saved?" She took it in both hands, unable to speak. The stone was cool and smooth, the color of clear desert sky. "I don't need this to remember," she whispered. Taza smiled faintly. "Still keep it." Then he mounted his horse. The sound of the saddle leather creaking was unbearably final. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice breaking. He looked toward the mountains. "Home," he said. "If the spirits still call me there." He hesitated, then leaned down slightly, his eyes burning into hers. "The wind will carry your name, Clara, I will hear it." And before she could answer, he nudged his horse forward. The sound of hooves faded across the prairie until there was nothing left but silence, and the turquoise stone glinting in her trembling hands. Clara stood there long after he disappeared, her heart breaking and healing all at once. She had known love for one night, and it had changed everything. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The mornings no longer brought peace, only the ache of absence. Clara woke to the hollow silence of the cabin, the smell of rain long gone, the echoes of Taza's voice lingering in the air. His turquoise pendant rested against her skin, hidden beneath her dress. Every time her fingers brushed it, she felt the faint hum of something alive, something that connected her to him still. But the world outside had shifted. 2 days after Taza's departure, Clara heard the thunder of horses. She stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the glare. 5 riders were approaching from the east, U.S. soldiers in dust-covered blue coats. The sight sent a chill through her blood. Sergeant Hale, the one with cold eyes and a scar across his cheek, dismounted first. Mrs. Whitaker, he greeted with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hope we're not intruding. Clara forced a polite tone. Not at all, Sergeant. What brings you this far from the fort? He spat into the dirt and scanned the horizon. We're tracking an Apache raider. Dangerous man. Escaped a skirmish near the Pecos. Some say he was wounded and headed north. Her heart lurched. She kept her face calm, her hands gripping the porch railing until her knuckles went white. An Apache? She asked, her voice barely steady. You think he came this way? Hale's sharp eyes flicked toward her. You live alone out here, don't you? Easy to miss a stranger hiding in these hills. Clara held his gaze, even as fear clawed at her throat. I've seen no one. He studied her for a long, unsettling moment. Then he shrugged and motioned to his men. Search the barn, the sheds too. Clara's breath caught. You have no right. Ma'am, he cut her off. We're under orders. As the soldiers scattered across her property, Clara stood motionless, the turquoise pendant burning against her chest like a secret ready to betray her. She prayed they wouldn't find the bloodstains by the creek, or the small scraps of cloth she hadn't been able to wash away completely. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the soldiers returned, shaking their heads. Hale turned back to her, his smirk cruel and knowing. You're a good woman, Mrs. Whitaker. I'd keep it that way. If we find out you've been harboring one of them savages, there'll be consequences. Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm. I understand. He tipped his hat mockingly and mounted his horse. If he comes back, he said, you send word. Apache are like wolves, they always circle back to what they want. And with that they rode off, dust and hoofbeats fading into the horizon. Clara didn't move until the last sound was gone. Then she stumbled inside, closing the door with shaking hands. She leaned against the wall, her breath coming in gasps. The pendant hung heavy on her skin and she clutched it tightly. They'll kill him, she whispered to the empty cabin. If he comes back, they'll kill him. But even as she said the words, she knew Taza would return. His promise was not one of idle men. It was one of blood and spirit. That night, a storm rolled in again. The wind howled across the plains and the old cabin groaned with it. Clara sat by the window, staring out into the dark, her lamp casting a soft glow over her face. Every flash of lightning made her heart leap, thinking she saw a silhouette in the distance. And just before dawn, she did. A lone rider, dark and still, paused on the ridge overlooking her homestead. She couldn't see his face, but she knew. Her breath caught as he turned his horse and disappeared into the canyon beyond. He was watching, protecting. But the soldiers would come again, and next time they wouldn't leave empty-handed. Clara pressed, her palm to the window pane, and whispered into the rising wind, Don't come back, Taza. Please. Not yet. But deep down she knew the Apache would never stay away, not when love had already bound them tighter than any fear could break. 3 weeks passed. The world around Clara moved on, but her heart did not. Each dawn came the same, quiet, cold, and empty. She did her chores, mended fences, milked the goats, baked bread, every movement mechanical. But at night, when the prairie wind whispered through the cracks of her cabin, she heard him. His voice, his breath, the soft echo of that one night that had undone her loneliness forever. She tried to convince herself he wouldn't return. Couldn't. Not with soldiers still circling these lands like hawks. But every sunset, her eyes drifted toward the western ridge, searching for a shadow she prayed not to see, and yet longed for more than air itself. Then one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Clara was gathering wood behind the barn when she froze. A sound, a faint rustle in the brush. Her heart raced. She turned slowly. Taza, she breathed. He stood half hidden by the cottonwoods, his horse behind him, the twilight painting his skin in gold and shadow. His face was harder now, his expression grave, but his eyes, The same fierce tenderness burned there. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, clutching the bundle of sticks to her chest. "I told you I would," he said, his voice low, roughened by miles and pain. She looked around nervously. The soldiers. They were here. "They'll come again." "I know," he said simply. "That is why I came." Her breath caught. "Why?" He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on hers. "Because I heard the white men speak your name near the river. They think you helped me." Clara's blood turned to ice. "They what?" "They will return, Clara." "Soon." Her throat tightened. "Then you should leave. If they find you here again, I will not leave you to face them alone." The defiance in his tone shook her, as much as it moved her. He had no right to risk his life for her, and yet the thought of facing this danger without him filled her with despair. "Please," she whispered. "You don't understand what they'll do to you." He tilted his head slightly, the hint of a wry smile ghosting across his lips. "I understand death. I do not fear it, but I will not watch them hurt you." Something inside her broke at those words. She dropped the firewood, the sound startling a nearby crow into flight. Then, before she could stop herself, she ran to him. He caught her easily, strong arms closing around her as if he'd been waiting all this time for her to fall into them again. She buried her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat thunder beneath her palms. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered again, tears slipping free. "And yet," he murmured, brushing his hand through her hair, "you are glad that I did." She didn't deny it. Couldn't. For a long moment they stood there in silence, wrapped in each other as the prairie wind carried the scent of rain and earth. Finally, she pulled back just enough to look at him. "What will we do?" He glanced toward the horizon, his expression sharpening. "We ride north. There are mountains there, places the soldiers will not go. You will be safe." She shook her head, panic flaring. "I can't just leave. This is my home." He met her gaze, his voice soft but firm. "Home is not walls and dirt, Clara. It is where your heart beats." Her lips trembled. "And yours?" His answer came without hesitation. "With you." The air between them stilled. The truth in his voice shattered the last of her resolve. But even as his words sank in, a sound broke through the stillness, the distant thud of hooves. Many of them. Taza's eyes darkened instantly. "They come." Clara turned, fear flooding her chest. Dust rose in the distance, riders moving fast. Soldiers. He caught her hand. "We must go, now." She hesitated only a second, then nodded. Together they ran for the barn, her heart pounding louder than the oncoming thunder of hooves. As they saddled the horses, Clara looked back at the cabin, the life she was leaving behind, the ghosts of 5 empty years. Then she looked at him, the man who had given her one night of love, and now risked everything for her life. And without another word, she whispered, "I'm ready." The desert stretched before them, wide open, merciless. The last rays of sunlight spilled across the sand as Clara and Taza rode hard into the growing dusk, the thunder of hooves behind them echoing like distant gunfire. "Faster!" Taza urged, his voice cutting through the wind. Clara clung to the reins, her heart hammering in rhythm with the pounding of her horse's hooves. Dust stung her eyes, the air dry and sharp in her lungs. The cabin, her home, was already swallowed by the horizon behind them. Ahead lay only shadows, canyons, and hope that barely flickered. The soldiers were close. She could hear them now. Angry shouts, metal clattering, the brutal rhythm of pursuit. Taza turned his head slightly, gauging the distance. "We must reach the canyon before moonrise," he said. "Once there, they cannot follow." Clara nodded, unable to speak. The desert wind tore her shawl loose and sent it spiraling away into the night. She didn't look back. They raced across the flats, the dying sun bleeding red over the mesas. Every moment felt borrowed. Her heart ached with terror, but beneath it all, she felt something else too. The fierce certainty that she would rather die beside him than live another day without him. After what felt like hours, Taza raised his hand sharply. "Down!" They veered off the main path, plunging into a narrow gully lined with boulders. The horses stumbled, kicking up dirt and pebbles. Clara's arms burned from the strain of holding on. They dismounted in the shadow of a rocky overhang. Both were breathless, their chests rising and falling in frantic rhythm. The air buzzed with heat and silence. Taza grabbed his rifle from the saddle. "They are near," he said grimly. Clara's eyes widened. "Then we should hide." He shook his head. "No. If I hide, they will find you. I will lead them away." Her stomach dropped. "No. You can't." He stepped closer, his hand cupping her face with that same unyielding tenderness that had undone her the first night. "Clara," he said softly, "if they catch you, they will hang you for helping me. I will not let that happen." Tears welled in her eyes. "I won't lose you again." His thumb brushed her cheek, smearing dust and tears together. "You saved my life. Let me save yours now." She shook her head violently, clutching his arm. "Taza, please." A sharp whistle cut through the air. Gunfire cracked in the distance. The soldiers had seen their tracks. Taza's gaze hardened. "Go, ride north. Follow the canyon until you see the stone shaped like a buffalo's head. There you will find my people." "What about you?" she cried. He smiled faintly, though his eyes burned with sadness. "I will find you when the stars return." And before she could stop him, he kissed her. Hard, desperate, full of everything they didn't have time to say. The world vanished for that single heartbeat. Then he pulled away, mounted his horse, and wheeled toward the open desert. "Taza," she screamed, reaching for him. But he was already gone, his dark silhouette vanishing into the red-gold horizon. A moment later, the soldiers' shouts grew louder, moving in his direction. Clara stood frozen, her chest aching, tears burning down her dust-streaked cheeks. Then, through the haze of fear, she did the only thing he'd told her to. She climbed onto her horse and rode. The canyon swallowed her soon after, the walls rising high on both sides like the ribs of the earth itself. The sound of her horse's hooves echoed off the stone, and behind her gunfire cracked again and again. When night fell, she stopped beneath the stars, trembling. She pressed her hand against the turquoise pendant beneath her dress. "Come back to me," she whispered to the wind. "Please." And though there was no answer, she thought she heard a faint sound in the distance, a cry fierce and wild. Like a hawk cutting through the night, somewhere out there Taza was still fighting, still alive, and Clara knew, one way or another, he would find her again. The night had been endless. Clara had ridden until her horse stumbled from exhaustion, until her arms were too weak to hold the reins. At last she found a dry hollow beneath a ridge and collapsed there, shaking and covered in dust. The world around her was silent, but for the whisper of wind through mesquite and sage. She tried to sleep, but every time her eyes closed she saw him, Taza, turning back toward the soldiers, the way his face had looked when he'd said, "I will find you when the stars return." She had whispered the words over and over through the long darkness like a prayer. When the first light of dawn touched the canyon walls, Clara stirred. Her body ached, her lips were cracked, her throat dry. But she stood, shielding her eyes from the rising sun. There, far to the north, a great stone stood out against the sky, shaped like the head of a buffalo. Just as Taza had said, her heart leapt. She climbed back onto her weary horse and urged it forward. Each step brought her closer, though fear gnawed at her. What if he hadn't survived? What if the soldiers had— "No," she whispered fiercely. "He's alive." Hours passed. The desert sun grew hot, the air shimmering. Just as her strength began to falter, movement flickered ahead, figures on horseback emerging from the heat. For a moment, panic gripped her. But then she saw them clearly. Tall, dark-haired riders, faces painted with earth and ash, their presence proud and silent. Apache. Clara reined in her horse, her heart in her throat. The riders surrounded her, their expressions guarded. A man dismounted, older, his braids streaked with silver. He studied her with eyes that seemed to pierce right through her fear. "You are not one of us," he said in slow, careful English. Clara shook her head. "No, but I was told to come. Taza sent me." At his name, the man's expression changed, a flicker of recognition, then sorrow. He turned, muttering something in Apache to the others. Her chest tightened. "Please," she begged. "Is he here? Is he alive?" The old man's gaze softened, though pain shadowed his eyes. "He was wounded when he came to us. He said he would not rest until he saw the white woman safe." Clara's vision blurred. "Then he made it?" The man nodded slowly, motioning for her to follow. They led her deeper into the canyon where a small stream wound between the rocks. Smoke from a fire rose gently into the air, and there, beneath the shade of a great cottonwood, lay Taza. Clara gasped and ran to him. He was pale, his chest bandaged, his breath shallow, but when she knelt beside him, his eyes opened. For a moment the world stopped. "You came," he whispered, voice ragged but alive, tears spilled down her cheeks. "You said you'd find me," she choked out. "But it was me who found you." A faint smile touched his lips. "The spirits, they guided you." She took his hand, pressing it against her heart. "No. You guided me." He looked at her then, really looked, and though his face was etched with pain, the fire in his eyes was undimmed. "I told you, Clara," he murmured. "My home is where your heart beats." She bent down, resting her forehead against his. "Then I'm never leaving you again." The morning light filtered through the cottonwood leaves, gilding their faces in gold. Around them the Apache stood silent, witnesses to a love that should never have been, and yet somehow was. For 5 years, Clara had lived without love, her heart starved and silent. But in one night, one impossible night, an Apache warrior had awakened something in her that refused to die. Now, as the desert wind moved softly around them, she knew she'd been right to follow her heart into danger, into exile, into love. Taza's hand tightened weakly around hers. "The sun rises," he whispered. She smiled through her tears. "And we rise with it." He closed his eyes, his breathing steady, his spirit calm at last. Clara looked up at the dawn spreading across the sky. Their dawn, and for the first time in years, she felt peace. Whatever came next, she was no longer the lonely widow of the plains. She was the woman the Apache had loved, and that love would live in her forever.